Very important topic today. Yeah, so it's my pleasure to carry on from the last time when we had such an interesting discussion on general principles of COVID management and then cardiovascular disease and COVID. And it's my pleasure to ask my friend, Dr. Deepak Padmanabhan, to give us talk on COVID and arrhythmias. He needs no introduction to all of us. He is a very accomplished electrophysiologist currently working at Geneva. So over to you, Deepak, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Vivek, for that kind introduction. Once again, just feel free to stop me if you think I'm going too long. The objectives mainly for this talk are going to be figuring out what the causality of arrhythmias are in patients with COVID-19. One is COVID-induced themselves, which are tachyarrhythmias and bradyarrhythmias. And two is exacerbation of chronic arrhythmia conditions. How do we manage arrhythmias during the period of acute infectivity, some case examples, and postulated outcomes in the long term? To begin with, arrhythmias for COVID, the prevalence of it has been mainly on two major studies initially. From the province of Hubei initially, where 7.3% of patients presented with arrhythmias as their presenting sign and symptoms. 17% of them from the general cohort who had arrhythmias once they developed COVID, and 44% of those patients who were in ICU who had arrhythmias. In New York, they had 6.1% patients who had a QTC greater than 500 at admission without HCQ in the beginning itself. And atrial arrhythmias were common in these patients, those who had invasive ventilations. So why are we bothered? On the worldwide case survey of hospitalized patients with COVID-19 infection, 7 in 10 had atrial arrhythmias and 1 in 5 developed ventricular arrhythmias. 4 out of 10 patients with arrhythmias were mechanically ventilated and only half of them survived. For acute malignant cardiac events in hospitalized COVID-19 patients, we had the death group and the discharge group, and all of these patients were monitored over 120 hours of telemetry. We found that in patients who passed away with in hospitalized COVID-19 patients, VTVF was around 11%, AV block was around 6%, and acute MI related arrhythmias and MI itself was around 8%. Compared to those in the discharged group, you had VTVF which was very low, AV block which was very low, and obviously acute MI which was very low. Malignant arrhythmias therefore occurred more commonly in patients who died from COVID-19, but overall only a minority of deaths in COVID-19 were caused by malignant arrhythmias. Coming to the worldwide survey that was done among the Asians, or the data that was there from Asia, in patients with COVID-19 infection and arrhythmias, the mean age was around 70 plus years, plus or minus 13 years. 70% of them were males. 54% of them had hypertension, 25% diabetes, 18% CAD. 22% of them were on HCQ at this point of time. And remember, this paper was in around mid-2020. 11% on azithromycin, 36% on anticoagulation, 93% on some kind of antiviral. 72.7% of them survived to discharge, and 27% of them were ventilated. Of the patients who presented with various types of arrhythmias, distinguishing by the type of arrhythmia, cardiac arrest patients obviously went into the ICU directly. Those patients who presented with atrial fibrillation had a reasonably good split between ICU admissions and non-ICU admissions. Same for bradyarrhythmias and NSVT. But the possibility of death obviously was much higher in patients who had cardiac arrest, much lower in terms of atrial fibrillation, bradyarrhythmias, and NSVT. Of note, patients who presented with atrial fibrillation or had atrial fibrillation were at higher risk of death than those patients who presented with NSVT or bradyarrhythmias. What are the usual predisposing factors in patients with COVID-19 who had arrhythmias? Postulating factors can be either there was direct myocardial injury or ischemia because of endothelial involvement, thereby causing vascular issues. Hypoxia or SIRS, thereby causing myocardial response to catecholamines that came all across the body. Electrolyte disturbances, medications and interactions, especially in the initial phases. And finally, fever unmasking dormant latent channelopathies, thereby related to causing arrhythmias which were unintentional. Pathophysiology, as we discussed, mainly can be broken down into 4 major parts: autonomic dysfunction per se, AV nodal injury, systemic inflammation causing the atrial part, arrhythmias part of it, and finally direct thrombosis of vessels or myocarditis causing ventricular issues. Now, coming to ventricular arrhythmias, these arrhythmias are mainly found to be ventricular fibrillation. And there was no precursor non-sustained VT that told you that, look, this patient could have some kind of ventricular fibrillation. There was a high rate of need for vasopressors, metabolic or hypoxic abnormalities in these patients. When autopsy was done in a number of two of them had pulmonary embolism when they passed away. 76% of them were on HCQ with an IQR of 1 to 5 days on which they were on, with a QTc increase of 550 milliseconds. 17% of them, however, had abnormal troponin values compared with only 1.5% otherwise. So abnormal troponin values went along with ventricular arrhythmias and telling you that this patient was not going to be doing very well. Therefore, the likely milieu was more the inflammation rather than inflammation within the myocardium or coronary vascular that resulted in these arrhythmias. It's more the systemic inflammation that was responsible for these arrhythmias. Similarly, AV block, it was part of a situation seen either with the MI or an enhanced MI in patients with refractory shock, or in rare occasions seen post-hospitalization. These patients are not immune once they go back home. A lot of them were associated with age greater than 65 years, obesity, and vasopressor use in the intra-hospital period. No cardiac predictor, however, predisposed to mortality. In patients who were having COVID but not admitted to the ICU, the most common arrhythmia was mainly atrial arrhythmias or SVTs. This was determined on basis of patients who were on oxygen therapy of around 3.3 liters per minute, not in the ICU, and were prospectively monitored continuously, and these arrhythmias were manually annotated. So in that cohort of patients who were not in the ICU and COVID-19, SVTs were your most common arrhythmias noted. Note here, new onset AF and atrial fibrillation were also present and not included in the SVT group. So patients who present this way, high likelihood that the presenting arrhythmia could be actually an SVT. Now coming to the effects of lockdown, what did lockdown do to outside hospital cardiac arrests? Now, obviously, outside hospital cardiac arrests increased when the Paris lockdown held in. This was one of the most prominent papers that came in, along with a host of other papers. Patients admitted alive obviously went down. Increased bystander CPR. There was poorer 30-day survival in patients, more so in the COVID patients as compared to the non-COVID patients. But was it exactly because of COVID-19 or the lockdown that caused this problem? So there was this follow-up that was done by Marion et al. On the Paris lockdown as such. And as you can see, as the number of cases of COVID went up, there was not too much difference between those patients who had OHCA in 2020 versus those patients who had OHCA over the last 6 to 7 years. Coming to a study coming out of Sweden, and just for background, Sweden did not institute a lockdown during the pandemic. So when you look at the OHCA and IHCA that happened in these patients, in patients who had outside hospital cardiac arrests, comparing the pre-lockdown to the pre-COVID era to the post-COVID era, the incidence was not very different, 1016 versus 930. The duration was around 3 to 6 months. Age was approximately the same. Witness arrests were obviously more in the OHCA group as pre-post group as compared to the OHCA pre. Chest-only compressions were more commoner for the resuscitation in patients during the lockdown or during the pandemic period as compared to without. And discharged alive were slightly lower. Overall death also did not differ. Compare that to patients who had cardiac arrest within the hospital during the pandemic era. You had nearly similar incidents. However, there was a high increase in the number of witnessed arrests which occurred in the ER when these patients presented there. Overall death rates did not differ. And this was a population in Sweden which had an OHCA of 20% rate, out of which COVID contributed to only 10% of all of these. And in IHCA, COVID contributed to only 16% of all of these. There was no significant difference in time to EMS arrival, time to CPR or defibrillation in this group of patients. There was, however, a 2.7% increase in arrests due to respiratory insufficiency in the OHCA group. which again can be determined or indicated by the chest-only compressions that was given by bystanders in this place. Now, coming to those patients who had COVID in this same cohort, how did they do? How well did they do? So this was approximately 10 or 16% of all OHCA and IHCA. No patient with COVID-19 and OHCA was discharged alive, compared to 36% of those who had OHCA without COVID-19 who were discharged alive. 7.5% cases only with COVID presented in a shockable rhythm to the hospital, compared to 22.8% without COVID-19. COVID patients within the hospital suffering an in-hospital cardiac arrest were less frequently monitored, and there were fewer witness arrests. And 61% of those patients who had IHCA and COVID died within 24 hours. The mortality with OHCA was 3.4 times than the baseline at 30 days, whereas with IHCA was nearly 2.3 times increase in death at 30 days. The postulated mechanisms for OHCA and COVID-19 are probably coexisting cardiovascular comorbidity associations, presence of ARDS, which was, or developing hypoxia, which was not recognized well, and exaggerated immune response, possibly over-the-counter drug therapy, heart failure and arrhythmias, or possibly prothrombotic event-mediated pulmonary embolism and acute coronary syndrome. However, at the end of this, in Sweden, they concluded that at best, it was associated with only 1/3 of the increase in OHCA and could not explain 2/3 of the increase that happened in this time period, indicating that perhaps the infrastructure was also very important in this period, and the lack of ventilatory support was critical in causing the changes in mortality. Now, coming to this interesting study, which was done again on a US database, where they looked at patients who were having ICDs in place and who were working from home. So remote monitoring was done in these patients. There was about 5,900 patients were on 24/7 remote monitoring using PaceMate, out of which nearly 50% were standard ICDs, nearly 48% were CRTDs. And they detected nearly 16,000 episodes of device-detected ventricular arrhythmias. And if you look at the comparison with previous period, within the COVID and within some control period, there was 75% less ventricular arrhythmias in the final week. During the COVID period, when people were working from home, there was a 32% reduction in ventricular arrhythmias during COVID-19, suggesting that perhaps outside hospital stresses, outside home stresses of day-to-day life contributed to ventricular arrhythmias in patients who were at risk for them, giving us food for thought for the future. Obviously, arrhythmic manifestations with COVID we have discussed, potential mechanisms we have thought about, and then management strategies. We've got to manage them similar to what we have otherwise. Generalized management, treatment in like non-COVID-19 critically ill patients. Specialized management mainly for the consideration inherited arrhythmia syndromes, QTC prolongation in those patients who have inadvertently taken drugs that prolong them, and drug interactions with COVID-19 therapy. One of the most important things we needed to remember was we have to optimize management protocols within hospitals to ensure that the EP team as well as the supporting staff had to be minimized exposure to these patients when they were ill and diagnose COVID infection when present in these patients. Triaging of EP procedures is also very important to ensure that only those patients who acutely required a procedure during the period of infectivity actually got them. Some of the management tips that were there were mainly for patients with AV block to consider using temporary permanent pacing to minimize PP use and HCW, healthcare worker risk. Defer the permanent pacemaker implantation given the potential for improvement in bradyarrhythmias. For atrial fibrillation, one of the most important things before converting to sinus rhythm was to wait before you converted to sinus rhythm, especially if it was the first episode. 48 hours of wait did not do anybody any bad, any harm. That was an NEJM trial that happened on that. If you had to still go ahead and decide on rhythm control, preferably use left atrial appendage thrombus ruling out mechanism via CT scan rather than a TEE. Polymorphic ventricular tachycardia, monitor very closely for QTC prolongation, avoid QTC prolonging drugs. Make sure electrolytes are taken care of, especially with symptoms of diarrhea in these patients. Potassium and magnesium deficiencies were not very unusual. Then pulseless electrical activity. Again, this was a challenging issue, both for presentation for bystanders in OHCA as well as in hospital. We had to be careful for reversible etiologies and had to consider telemetry monitoring for all patients with COVID-19 infection and elevated cardiac biomarkers. Again, when patients were presented with outside hospital cardiac arrest, the recommendations given by EHRA were to determine the initial rhythm, especially if asystole, to consider only manual chest compressions, non-rebreather mask, face mask and valve, while wearing 2-ply or 3-ply face mask for the bystander or health personnel at that site. Only a single attempt for a trained person to do field ET or even in the hospital with less than 20-second pause in the CPR. Also, a supraglottic airway should be gone to much faster than later. For patients presenting with asystole, early termination of resuscitation was to be considered, and highest benefits were found for VT or VF at around 20 minutes. Just a slide to remind everyone of the measurement of QT interval, particularly given the drugs that are coming in. It's the tangent method, and even for patients with biphasic T waves, it's the sharpest slope that is to be used and not the end of the T wave. With patients with pre-existing arrhythmias, if you had loss of rhythm control in patients who were previously controlled well with drugs, COVID was supposed to be suspected. Liberal use of remote monitoring technologies in patients who could afford it, as well as key partnerships or collaborations with local Indian manufacturers of remote monitoring equipment. If you were working with a device company, device interrogations, especially near end of service or near elective replacement interval, it was good to use minimum outputs as needed so that patients didn't have to come back into the hospital fast. And finally, have a discussion over a video conference if required with patient regarding enrollment into remote monitoring services. If newer implants were to be considered, evaluate the benefits of remote monitoring capabilities before implanting the device, thereby giving the patient a chance at it. Excuse me. Ensure adequate medication stocks. That was one of the biggest problems that we faced, mainly anticoagulation, and the recent lack of availability of mexiletine became a big challenge. ECD recording centers also, when patients became symptomatic, to identify centers close to the patient's house, use devices which recorded ECGs at home, like Cardia, Sanket Live, and so on, and use devices that have continuous monitoring in terms of Holter with real-time uploading. This was also a pilot study that was conducted where they attempted remote initiation of medications, especially drugs like Sotalol, which required remote monitoring with the help of an adhesive patch or the AliveCore Cardia. Our cath lab protocol changed, and I would leave that protocol to be discussed in my subsequent talk in the subsequent talk by Dr. Ulhas. But essentially, we followed the same and ablated only for either patients with VT storm or recurrent VT, and lead extraction as needed when in sepsis. So what do we do once we are outside the initial problem? Patients are still left with ischemic or non-ischemic cardiomyopathy, subclinical diastolic or systolic abnormalities, PVCs, how to risk stratify these patients thereon, and finally presence or absence of atrial fibrillations that may occur. Now, coming to the worry about post-COVID cardiac injury and its association with arrhythmias, why are we concerned? See, COVID is a cardiotropic virus. The coronavirus is a cardiotropic virus. In the Toronto SARS infection, 35% had RNA in the autopsied hearts. In COVID-19 patients in the autopsy studies, 62.5% patients out of an N of 32 had virus detected in the cardiac tissue. Elevated troponin levels during the index admission was indicative of a poorer prognosis, but the lack of elevation was protected even with those with having previous disease or severe disease. What do we know from the sequelae of other viral myocarditis studies? That post myocarditis, 6.6% had event rates for ICD shocks or sudden cardiac arrest on long-term follow-up. MRI studies showed a non-ischemic pattern of late gadolinium enhancement. There was 34% incidence of new onset atrial fibrillation on follow-up versus a 47% incidence of ventricular arrhythmias. Annual heart failure hospitalization rates increased by 6 to 8%. And there was an increase in cardiometabolic demand that was noted, thereby decompensating patients who were previously well compensated. There was inappropriate sinus tachycardia, which was already seen with other SARS infections, probably because of either intrinsic sinus node hyperactivity or central sinus node hyperactivity. Post-viral infections, POTS or postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome is already known. And it is critical that we avoid aerobic activity unless there is normalization of markers and perhaps resolution of imaging findings. What are the features unique to COVID? Now, COVID is similar to the other SARS virus that was there initially, but the ACE2 receptor mediated cardiotropism was more effective with changes in the spike protein, which not only allowed it to integrate within the cells faster, but also spread faster. Now, remember, adipocytes also have ACE2 receptors. So once the virus goes inside the adipocytes, you had a way to maintain inflammation. So the more obese you were, the more chance that inflammation would be maintained over a long period of time, thereby leading to maintenance of systemic inflammation and maintenance of epicardial inflammation, which could contribute to arrhythmias because of the epicardial fat. A putative link that has been described for future CAD or arrhythmias is the use of corticosteroids, however brief it may be, and the renin-angiotensin system dysregulation that happens because of the trophism for this virus for the ACE receptors. Now, this was a study which was conducted with troponin positive patients on the initial infection. 148 patients were enrolled. 33% of these patients were ventilated on the initial admission. All these patients were troponin positive. At 2 months' time, or a median of 68 days, 89% of them had normal LV function. All of them were subjected to an MRI with or without an adenosine stress protocol as required. It was found that there was LGE in these patients in nearly 54%. However, if it was a non-ischemic pattern which was seen, it was localized to 3 segments, mainly in the mid-LV, basal LV. There was a new ischemic injury pattern which was seen in 66%. And you had a combination of myocarditis alone, ischemic alone, or a combination of myocarditis and MI which was seen in these patients. Again, a word of caution while interpreting MRI images post-COVID-19 infection. Not only there can be direct myocardial injury, but we need to confirm the LGE with T2 imaging. The myocarditis definitions by the Lake-Lewis criteria are mainly defined on T2. T1 is used to figure out whether there is diffuse fibrosis or inflammation. The increased inflammatory markers can cause increased permeability of vasculature due to the damage of the endothelial ACE2 receptors, thereby causing changes in the extracellular fluid, which can then be misinterpreted as myocardial edema. Now, with the about 6 studies that looked at long-term follow-up of COVID and arrhythmias, only one study looked at it and found an incidence of 10.9% palpitations incidence in the follow-up long-term. However, there was a model that was recently published to determine, based on initial symptoms in the first week of illness, whether or not you would develop long COVID. Long COVID for the purpose of this study was any symptoms beyond 28 days. It was found that if you had more than 5 of these in the first week of illness, the odds ratio of you having long COVID was nearly 3.5. And in this cohort of nearly 4,182 cases, 13.3% of these patients had long COVID. If you extended the definition to 12 weeks, nearly 2.3% patients still had symptoms. Now, POTS and COVID. Now, POTS and COVID is a unique combination. One, it's already been defined in the past that these viral infections can have autonomic issues. But in acute phase, in COVID infections, dysautonomia was found to be nearly 2.5% of these patients. Now, POTS can also called what is called the Grinch heart, whereby you're feeling tired, you don't exercise. Because you don't exercise, you have cardiovascular decompensation, which further on calls you to have more fatigue and more dyspnea. There's also a thought that there may be destruction of extracardiac postganglionic presynaptic neurons. Because of destruction of presynaptic neuron receptors, what happens is the regulation of the sympathetic outflow is lost, thereby causing increased local sympathetic outflow. Also, central sympathetic outflow can be increased, and perhaps there's also autoimmunity against these receptors. In long-term management for potential arrhythmias, we have to consider standard therapy and imaging during the acute period, and on follow-up in the convalescent phase, look at cardiac monitor depending on symptoms.
Deepak, can we start, winding it up, because I think we need to have some time for questions too.
Absolutely. Looking at convalescent phase with advanced imaging as well as standard post-MI therapy. In management, we have to consider RAS inhibitors and avoid sudden cessation. Guideline-directed management if low EF is present, and there has been studies to show that withdrawal of these leads to increased death even in patients who recovered from COVID. Routine therapy has not been defined for POTS and IST so far. Beta blockers remain our best role, and individualized decision-making for amiodarone has to be considered. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, Deepak, and I'm sure people have a lot of questions. So at this stage, I would introduce our worthy moderators. That's Dr. Nambudri, Dr. Karthikeya, Dr. Ameya, and Dr. Sankla. So I think the lesson I learned from this was that all the malignant arrhythmias in the hospitalized patients are actually just a marker of a very bad patient. And that just like the MI data, a lot of our stressors come from workplace and outside our home. So lockdowns are good for the humankind. But I think the biggest problem all of us are facing is this terrible tachybrady kind of syndromes, postural symptoms, severe fatigue, tachycardias. And so I think question for Deepak and for the moderators, the most important one being that a lot of these patients have heart blocks during their acute period. So how long do you on an average wait for it to resolve or to go in with a pacemaker?
I've had, if I can take that, Dr. Chaturvedi.
Yes, please, yeah.
There was a case on there which actually showed a patient followed up to 120 days. Acute patient presented with heart blocks, paced with a temporary permanent, managed up to 21 days post-infection in the hospital, slowly weaned off the temporary permanent, did an MRI, showed some basal gadolinium enhancement, followed him up to 120 days. The ECG and the rhythm remained back to normal, but progressively now the patient is starting to show a right bundle branch block. So it's kind of not very sure where this is progressing. I would start to think that in these patients, we start using PET more liberally rather than just using an MRI. Because sustained persistent inflammation is what is causing this. There have been a couple of patients who presented 1 month post-COVID infection presented with high-grade AV blocks. Our oldest patient at Jayadeva, who's had an AV block which has recovered intra-infection, has been 82 years of age. So there is no good way. That's why temporizing the pacemaker implantation seems to be the best way for now. And perhaps using a temporary permanent in these patients may be of more benefit rather than going ahead with a permanent implantation. That's the way we are thinking of it. Love to hear the panel's response.
Karthik, you have been at a very high COVID volume center. So I'm sure you came across many such circumstances. What has been your policy regarding this?
Yes, so despite having seen a lot of COVID patients, I would say that the risk of AV block requiring pacing is not very high actually. So in last 1.5 years, I would have done procedures in about 4 or 5 patients only who required pacing for AV block due to COVID. And couple of them were actually post 14 days period also. So we went ahead and did permanent pacing in most of them. There were a couple of other patients who, one of them actually had a severe LV dysfunction, left bundle branch block, and came with recurrent syncope, and actually came for an elective CRTD implant from an outside state and was found to be COVID positive. And his fever actually developed 3-4 days later. So I adopted a policy of giving him a 7 days Holter and sent him home because the cause of syncope was not very clear in that patient. And during Holter, we found that patient was having intermittent AV block. And so with symptoms, we had to do it while his isolation period was still on. Another patient, he had already a pacemaker. So I would not say it's anything related to COVID, but he never came for a follow-up, and just when he came for a follow-up, it was found that his battery has actually depleted because he came with syncope, and incidentally he was found to be COVID positive. We offered him to replace it, but he again didn't get admitted. But due to recurrent syncope at home, we had to do it again. He came to the emergency. I had to do a temporary first and then replacement in that patient also. But what we found, and that may be a discussion part in the subsequent talk, is the problems that we face during these procedures. So maybe we can discuss those during that time. But I would say that the requirement of pacing is actually not very high in most of these patients.
Okay, so Dr. Nambudri, I would like to ask you regarding this terrible Tachy and Brady syndromes which keep on happening in these people. And I'm currently having a patient, the heart rate just shoots up. Otherwise, you give a beta blocker and it goes down. It's very, very frustrating. And I'm sure already there are many registries going on in at least in North America right now for IAST and POTS post-COVID. There is an emerging role of ivabradine in this. So overall, what has been your experience with this kind of symptoms, and what has been your management approach?
Yeah, we also have seen a few cases with some sort of autonomic dysfunction following COVID. We don't manage patients during the phase of COVID, but we have seen many cases with the persisting sinus tachycardia after COVID, and it could be related to multiple factors, including anxiety and other factors as well. We have managed with either beta blockers or ivabradine in these cases. Otherwise, regarding bradycardia, I think the myocardial inflammation directly enough to cause a complete heart block needs more evidence. It is probably just a coincidental because in community, COVID is quite common. Patients presenting with the bradyarrhythmia is also. There are reports and a series also. But to demonstrate clearly and to have a cause-effect relationship, we need further evidence. One option in this state, I mean, one way we generally can go ahead is to do MRI in some of these patients, and gadolinium enhancement alone will not be sufficient because that shows only interstitial fibrosis. There is an evolving strategy. We are actually using it in cases of DCM, and it's also in the literature is heat mapping during T1. And many of you might be aware of that already. I know this is actually to look for a specific sequencing. And you can, that indicates the increase in the extracellular volume and myocardial derangement. This indicates there is an ongoing myocardial inflammation. This is quite specific. There are a few reports that have shown, varying results in COVID as well, but the logistics of doing MRI in these patients, we know it's not very simple. But when the patient comes with the bradycardia, we generally go with a semi-permanent pacing, and we take a decision later. That is what we do.
So, Dr. Ameya, Dr. Yash has posed a very interesting thing that, this ICD data which Deepak presented, very, very fascinating data. So would that mean that most of these things are happening at work, or it's just that the lockdown has, brought more peace to the world overall?
I was thinking that the incidence of ventricular arrhythmias will go up because of the COVID stress. But then Deepak presented very interesting data, and that is extremely heartening to know that these arrhythmias have come down by working at home. So definitely, I think traveling and work pressures going outside, especially, must be causing some amount of chronic stress. It may not be acute stress, but chronic stress, as we all know, over a long period, small amounts of stress can cause problems, especially sympathetic activity overload. So that could be one of the reasons. Otherwise, in fact, in COVID, we would expect the arrhythmias to go up because there have been multiple papers saying that arrhythmias do increase even if there is no myocarditis. In fact, I think last JAMA Open said that even QTC prolongs by 60 milliseconds in almost 25% of the patients without any active drug being involved there. So it's very heartening to know that. Of course, regarding sudden cardiac arrest, prognosis, we are not sure because I think survival was not much of difference when it comes to CPR. There is not much of survival difference in those patients.
Yeah, Ameya, contrary to what was published by Dr. Sanders in European Heart Journal in February 2021, JAHA has published in a couple of days back another similar study that had shown out-of-hospital defibrillator shocks are much more. It was done in 3 cities, New York City, Boston, and one more, and published from Minneapolis. So that has shown 17 per 1,000 patients compared to 11 in the previous lesson. So the number of shocks they have shown, it has increased.
In fact, I have, in my experience, I have at least 3 patients whom I know who had VT storm, and they were detected to be say COVID positive. And in fact, when we did an MRI, one turned out to be an ARVD, and one was a ischemic heart. So definitely there was an increase in the arrhythmia burden in those patients, and they all 3 were positive. So general observation was that patients' arrhythmias were more common in the ICU setting rather than the ward setting. I did almost 8 weeks of ward work in COVID wards, and we hardly saw any arrhythmias. In fact, all the arrhythmias which I had reference was only from the ICU, and commonest arrhythmias was AF. In fact, majority of the patients, which we normally see in multi-system disorders, where say systems are failing. And other arrhythmia was the QT prolongation because of adding amiodarone, already you have a toxic drug protocols which are going on. And on that, when AF develops, they start adding amiodarone, which also worsens the situation. So then adding torsades. So that was what I observed. In fact, bradyarrhythmia I hardly saw. Now, actually, post-COVID, we are seeing sinus arrhythmia with anxiety and hypotension.
So if
So there are
add a couple of comments, just to clarify, what I have understood is that the arrhythmias in patients who already have heart disease, which predisposes to arrhythmia, if they develop COVID, the arrhythmias are significantly high and it increases the mortality. However, if we have studied the effect of lockdown in general, patients who do not have cardiac disease, do not have COVID, the general incidence of arrhythmias has come down. And that's what my feeling is. And that's what the study which Dr. Deepak showed also suggested. Yes, Dr.
I completely agree with this. There are 2 more questions in the chat box, and either Dr. Sankla or Deepak can take that. So one is obviously this troponin business, because a lot of times you're finding people who are apparently not so bad at home, but some physician ordered a troponin level and it has come twice elevated, the high sensitivity troponin. So what is your take on that? And the second part is whether the cytokine storm in the second week itself is also capable of that gross myocardial damage sometimes seen in these people.
The Thuragram study actually showed that it was the inflammatory milieu that was responsible for everything. It was not the scar, or it was not a myocardial involvement per se. It was the inflammatory milieu that was responsible for all your arrhythmias, all your abnormal events that were happening. So I would not put it beyond the cytokine storm itself to cause a myocarditis-like picture. In fact, it is conceivable that with this amount of stress, you could even develop a Takotsubo kind of picture, because the amount of cytokines that are going on in your body, it would not be unreasonable to consider these patients having a lowering of LV function because of that kind of a physiology. So I would think it's possible. Troponin elevation essentially means injury. So I would think that any amount of troponin elevation warrants these patients to have a slightly longer follow-up, closer follow-up, find out what's going on with them. And per se, it's my feeling that in the ICU or in a patient who's having desaturations requiring oxygen, troponin can be a marker for looking at long-term follow-up. Maybe not for the immediate prognosis of the patient, but long-term follow-up. And essentially, in patients who presented with first-time arrhythmias, who've never had arrhythmias before, presenting to you with an arrhythmia, we have tended over the last year and a half to look at the mechanism of the arrhythmia. If it is a mechanism that is suggestive of an automatic or a triggered etiology, these patients, we've been able to kind of guess and say, look, this may be COVID positive. I don't have the numbers to tell you, look, we were positive in these many patients, they came out to be RT-PCR positive. But the mechanism being automatic seems to be a kind of a marker for us, at least, that look, this patient may have COVID positive, presenting to you as an arrhythmia, otherwise asymptomatic with no other symptoms.
Deepak, do you have any comment on viroporins?
Sorry, sir?
Viroporins. Because I was reading one article from Nature, they said that the virus can encode their own ion channels called viroporins, and that's why alter the ion channel morphology of our
It's,
native muscle.
it's highly possible. It's known. There was one which talked about ion channels, but I didn't know they had their own ion channels.
Yeah, they encode their own.
Definitely in a lab, I guess.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So I think this virus is we still haven't got a handle of it overall. There were recent reports that it's getting incorporated into the DNA also. That's the reason why you can detect it even 30 days afterwards in the swabs. I think very interesting discussion, but probably we'll wind it up here for the next talk, which is very important for all of us, and that's the protocols to be followed for EP and ready procedures during this time. So over to you, Dr. Ullas.
Vivek, thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. I would quickly start my topic here. I'm sharing my screen, and I hope it is seen. Vivek, it is seen, and I'm heard.
Yes.
All right. So, it is my privilege to be here and to talk about the protocol what we adopted in our hospital, which, you can consider the Desi protocol in the absence of we having our own protocol by the society. Whatever we are practicing, I'm calling it as a Desi protocol. Currently, it appears to me that the numbers are looking less sinister. And it also appears to me, at least in the last 1 week, the second wave appears to be ebbing. But it could also be that it's a temporary period of calm before the third storm. Looking at so far the winners, for example, in the Far East, Taiwan, Japan, they all claim that they almost had won, but now they are facing a crisis. They are going through a grim situation. While the scientists are trying to find out exact origin of this deadly virus, and they are looking at the means to contain the pandemic, we physicians have a very important role. We need to treat the COVID affected with compassion. And I believe that many deaths happened with COVID infection, not necessarily because of the COVID infection, but because those COVID affected were not given the guideline directed therapy for their comorbidities. I think that number should be very significant among the mortality that is due to the COVID infection. We need to treat the affected COVID patients, especially if they have comorbidities, with much compassion, with as much of the guideline-directed therapy. At the same time, we should protect our health team, we should protect our family, and of course, we've got to take care of ourselves. So these are all the elements which we need to be taking into account when you make a protocol in this pandemic era. There have been several protocols ever since it was declared a pandemic. Within 2 months, the first society, it was the Heart Rhythm Society from US, in collaboration with the American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology, they brought the first of the protocols with respect to the EP and device management in this pandemic era, followed soon by Cardiology Society of Australia and New Zealand and European Society of Cardiology, and followed by Latin America, etc. Even though we do not have one. What is important is, I believe those protocols which have been published, they are not probably completely relevant at this point in time, because the COVID infection or it's a trend or its behavior is changing. So the protocols need to be up to date, in line with the changing behavior of the pandemic. And most importantly, the protocols need to be designed according to the physician's own requirement, his setup, the hospital setup, and the institutional setup. The important component of the protocol would be the triaging of the procedures during this COVID pandemic. It would be convenient if you look at your interventions and classify them into urgent or elective. Urgent, you may consider when the risk of death or immediate decompensation is quite high. And elective, one can consider as that intervention which could be postponed indefinitely or till a convenient time. The interventions in our institute which we consider urgent are, for example, when the patient comes with a MITI-STORM or an equivalent and then drugs are not okay, and then you are going to be considering an RFA. Similarly, even for SVTs, if they are very recurrent, frequent, and then they are drug refractory. Of course, symptomatic high degree AV blocks or bradyarrhythmias. Lead revision for malfunction in a patient who is pacemaker dependent. Another pacemaker dependent if he has his generator which has reached the end of service, it would be considered urgent. Of course, cardioversion, whether chemical or electrical cardioversion when the hemodynamically unstable arrhythmia, if you're encountering, that would also be considered urgent. In a patient who has had syncopal episodes, documented VTs, I do not think that should be postponed because he has the immediate risk of sudden death. So we consider an ICD. Secondary prevention is also an urgent. And if there is a component of LV dysfunction and indications are appropriate, maybe a CRTD. Whereas some of those interventions could be postponed indefinitely or till a convenient time. There could be a generator change for ERI, lead revision for infection. Primary prevention ICDs could be postponed really very indefinitely, especially even with or without the CRT indication for the primary prevention. Avoidable procedures are also there. They could be postponed quite indefinitely and maybe definitely when the pandemic fear or pandemic is no more existing. For example, routine RFA cases where there's no hemodynamic compromise, where the patient is not so severely debilitated because of the symptoms. The usual practice of cardioversion for recent onset, even if it's stable atrial fibrillation, what you do cardioversion electively, it could be postponed very well. TE before a cardioversion, we have been postponing it and not doing it. We are preferring the CT. And of course, CRT-P implants without an indication for a defibrillator, we are not done in this pandemic. What is more important is one needs to have a dedicated cath lab. COVID-19 positive, and very rarely when fortunately the EP interventions are never so very emergent like, say for example, a primary PCI. So we have never taken any patient whose COVID status is not known for an intervention. Whenever we have done COVID-19 positive patient intervention, maybe it was a storm ablation or a pacemaker or some other procedure, we always have intervened in that patient in our lab, in one of our labs which have been dedicated for COVID-19 positive patients, wherein our engineers have modified the entire cath lab in many contexts. Number one, the ventilatory system. Our cath lab has had a positive pressure ventilation system that had been converted into negative pressure, positive to negative pressure ventilation, so as to suck out the air, suck the air out of the chamber through the HEPA filters. Our engineers have also isolated that particular room air conditioning system so as to not to contaminate the adjoining rooms. Our nurses and other medical staff have been very careful about disposing and sterilization of the consumables which could be reused. So this is a very, very, I do not know the exact details how they have been doing, but I am told that this particular area had been seriously seen or overseen by a senior nurse. That particular cath lab also has been provided with the UV light based disinfection. It's of utmost importance that we take care of our device representatives who have been visiting in the earlier times for their regular services for the device programming. We need to be protecting them so as to by avoiding them to visit often to our place. So we have trained 2 of our hospital staff who could do the basics of the basics handling of the programmer. We recently have launched in the country something called remotely controlled programming, especially with the Medtronic devices, which I will talk in a short while in a little more detailed fashion. So by these two means, we try to protect these device representatives coming to the hospital, and probably that would also avoid them to spread the infection if they are at all asymptomatic carriers. The device follow-up could be made easy by several means. Remote monitoring is one of the fantastic means by which you can avoid the patients coming all over to your place. Remotely, you can monitor. And I'm going to be talking about what is that remotely controlled programming. We have been using in the recent times magnet often, and then we have been actually supplying magnets to some of the hospitals, and then I'm going to be explaining how we have been looking after the device management. Remote monitoring, as everyone is aware, it avoids unnecessary clinical visits and reduces the exposure to the healthcare workers. What is important is, in fact, in our hospital, 90 to 95% of all of our devices, they have got the remote monitoring with them. And those patients who have not had the remote monitoring, we are encouraging them to have a chargeable unit. And some of those patients who are having some basics models of the mobiles to convert it into higher end smartphones so as to make their devices more compatible with the remote monitoring, and so that they can be monitored remotely and safely. This is a concept which must be new to many of the audience today. And this is known as the remote pacemaker control and reprogramming. By this technology, one can control your pacemaker clinic itself remotely, or one can manage an emergency reprogramming remotely. For example, a patient is outside the city or outside your hospital where an emergency reprogramming is required, not necessarily interrogation, but also reprogramming is required. It is possible you sitting in your office or at home and managing and interrogating and manipulating the device. That's possible these days with the Medtronic devices at least. We have done some elective programming remotely when the patient required to undergo some imaging like MRI or surgery. So this is the scene here, how a device can be programmed, interrogated remotely. What is required is the programmer to be taken care by any one of the hospital staff or any educated person. What he has to simply do is to connect the programmer to an electrical unit, and then this could be connected via the internet to your laptop, so that your laptop starts acting like the programmer, and you can take control of this completely and not only interrogate and program. I will show the one small video what we have made recently. Your laptop becomes another programmer on your table. What actually is seen on the programmer comes exactly on your screen. You can interrogate the device. And for example, here I am trying to do some electrical operation. So control the programmer remotely. And I think this is a great technology. So magnet programming is also possible provided some of those criteria is met. For example, if you know that the patient had been seen not more than 6 months before, and you are also fairly sure that the device has not reached the ERI or the EOL status, we have been encouraging the patients not to come, but to go to a nearby clinic where a magnet is available. The program, the company recommended magnet is available there, and then we can actually do the battery status, and maybe even in electronic devices you can do the threshold margin tests. And we have sent magnets. Earlier, a device representative used to go to a place of surgery, convert the device into some asynchronous mode, especially when the surgery would have impaired the pacemaker functionality. So we are providing the magnet, and as long as the surgery is there, magnet is placed, and then the device is made into asynchronous mode. I'm going to be showing one interesting case where all these technologies which I described came into use, and things are all made without anybody going out of the hospital and remotely controlled. So that I would call it as the utility of the remote monitoring and magnet to the rescue of a patient. So what was that? It was recently on 26th April, we had a red alert in the evening. The red alert is from DXICD Biotronic device. The alert read that the patient within few hours had 11 ineffective maximum energy shocks. And when we looked at the trace, it was clear that all of them were inappropriate shocks, and that was because of the T-wave oversensing. When we call the patient, the attender picks up the phone and he says the patient has been COVID affected and he is in ICU on a ventilator. Shockingly, we understood that the hospital staff did not know that the patient is getting the shocks. It's because he's ventilated, maybe the staff is less, or maybe we do not really know the reason why those shocks, which could have been easily visible, they were not noticed. So we had to call the hospital staff, and we sent a magnet, and then we inactivated from the point of view of tachycardia therapy. So this was a classic case how in this pandemic, how the remote monitoring helps, and sometimes how even a simple unit like magnet might help. So the COVID or protocol or mantra is to take care of all those things what I mentioned, but most important, I think we need to work and rest in a vaccinated environment. We should encourage vaccination of all our staff, all our family members, and we should consider that the COVID hasn't yet done its worst, and then we should take all the precautions. In summary, we may triage our patient group, elective emergency. We need to have a dedicated cath lab, protecting the device representatives as to train your own people or make use of the newer technologies, make many patients to adopt the remote monitoring. And if you have this remote controlled programming in your place, make use of that. And the one which you have been not using very often, carefully, we can use the magnet programming. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ulas. This was quite wonderful. So a couple of questions here. One is...
Yes.
Yeah. So one is that does the use of surgical cautery increase the risk of infection while you're implanting?
Use of cautery, would it increase the infection rate? In general, or this COVID?
No. Well, I mean, as pertinent to us in sense of many times you have to use the cautery for pacemakers and all that. So
I was wondering, is the question is something to do with the patient with the COVID? Now you are doing a procedure and the cautery is used.
Cautery is used.
I'm not very sure, as long as you are covered the way for example, the PPE and the rest of the protective equipments, if you are using it carefully, and then especially from our side, it is only something to do with the cautery, that is during the device implantation. I do not think we should be afraid of it so very much as to avoid the cautery, because I think cautery is one of the important tools to reduce the hematomas and make the wound clean. So I have not hesitated to use the cautery when there was a requirement of a pacemaker implant.
So I may
Deepak,
just.
you were going to say something about the case, and so could you just in a brief, I'll just explain what you were trying to tell you about the protocols in your place.
Sir, we don't have the luxury of remote monitoring, so that is a challenge at our place. But what we've done is we've tried to decrease the outputs to the bare minimum required, especially on patients with chronic implant thresholds. We've tried to figure out when the elective replacement interval is going. The end of service is going to be for patients who've reached elective replacement interval for their visits to the hospital, and made sure that it is told to the patient exactly, so they are following exactly on the same day and not very early or very late. Then we've been very careful in ensuring that all patients are given temporary pacing only. Cautery, when we don't know the RT-PCR status, we've not used the cautery because we believe that aerosolization actually increases the risk of infection. And in the absence of that, it's just manual dissection. At Jayadeva, with Sir around, it has always been manual dissection. Cautery has been a very rare usage, unfortunately or fortunately. But other than that, Sir, this has been the routine stuff for routine patients. Lead extractions, we've still done it because sepsis has been a worry. We've still extracted leads with COVID patients in place. We've ablated VT storms, we've ablated incessant VTs. That's the main change in the protocol. Mexeltine was a big problem for us because Mexeltine ran out. All our patients started having issues with it. We briefly considered phenytoin, but now we've gotten lucky with a company called Tasmed, which is giving Wellheart as the trade name to provide Mexeltine. So we've been able to tide over that. One important thing that I've done is I've made sure that for our patients who are contacting us, we've made sure of local ECG recording centers, and we've encouraged patients to develop a relationship with them so that if they are symptomatic, they can go there immediately instead of rushing over to Jayadeva and do a lot of remote monitoring or remote sending of ECGs. And quite a few of our patients have been able to purchase Sanket Live, which is the Indian version of Alive Core, and it has worked well so far for our patients.
I just
you know what? Can I answer that question? Dr. Yash is asking, a technician is anyway needed bedside. How is this an advantage? I think it's a great question. I forgot to mention here that a technician is not required. Any person, in fact, a relative, as long as the programmer is available. What it is required is the programmer's lid has to be opened up. It's going to be connected to an electrical unit. And then there has to be an internet facility. And that's all that it is. And Ashish Nabar has been asking that, there are a lot of concerns. Yes, the concerns regarding the remote controlled programming could be, there is, for example, sudden communication interruption or sudden electrical supply interruption. There are certain things which you cannot do remotely. For example, you cannot switch off the device. You cannot deactivate ventricular fibrillation therapy. You cannot inhibit the pacing. You can do threshold testing. You cannot inhibit and look for the intrinsic rhythm. And there are a few more. And then you cannot harm the patient. All those precautions have been taken. I consider this is going to be a great tech. That's going to be the way the devices are going to be interrogated. This is my thinking.
So Dr. Yash, I mean, this is the question I had also posed, and Ajit is also writing here now. I mean, as a society, what is our consensus on the timing of an elective procedure post-COVID recovery? I mean, how long are we going to wait? What is the recommendation for that?
Yeah, I think everyone, should we as IHRS give some recommendation? Because the thing is, we have been asking, I'm sure everybody is asking their local sort of COVID experts and physicians, and that's what I have been doing. And generally, if the procedure is elective, obviously after a COVID infection, my simple logic is if it's needed, but yet it's elective, it's then wait for a month. That is my rule of thumb. Wait for a month, 2 weeks. In 1 week patients become, this is my understanding, that in 1 week most become non-infective. You still normally would not do a RT-PCR, but you do an RT-PCR at the end of 4 weeks, and then I wait for 4 weeks. Otherwise, minimum 2 weeks. In the first 2 weeks, no procedure. That's what we have been following.
So,
I have not had
Dr.
to do any procedure in a COVID positive patient, but I guess like Karthikeya says, someone has complete AV block, then and which is not resolving, then you put a temporary wire and wait, I guess, or you have to decide sometime. But I have luckily not faced that situation so far.
So, Dr. Karthik, there's also a question in the chat box, and then you were mentioning that about your experience of implantations during the COVID times. So the question is that is Sucherdine infection more of a problem during the COVID times? I mean, and what are your views on that?
That it is not related to COVID per se, but because of the use of steroids, and that actually applies to all other patients who are on steroids for other reasons like sarcoidosis, etc. So a couple of things that which I learned from my experience is, like somebody said, use of electrocautery. So apart from the things that you have to do, like changing your ventilation pattern in your cath lab or using PP and all, I would suggest not to do anything which you are not used to. If you don't use electrocautery, then it is fine. But if you are used to use electrocautery, I would suggest you still do it. The reason is that the risk was actually was based on a surgical study in which it was shown that ascitic fluid in patients, or in abdominal fluid, when patients with abdominal surgery, it causes aerosolization. But now we understand that the pathogenesis of the virus, we have understood it much better. We know it is an airborne infection, so it doesn't actually matter. And if you are protected with an N95 mask and good PPE, whether there is aerosolization or not will not make much difference. And initial 2 cases where I didn't use cautery, I had a problem. Patient had a lot of bruising. Again, the steroids may have been contributing to that, but in next few cases, I used cautery, and it gives you more confidence and much better hemostasis and much better clinical outcome. So that's what.
I have one question. May be very simplistic, but we don't do any procedures without RT-PCR. Now, in a RT-PCR negative patient, I don't see what is the logic of not using a cautery. I don't see the logic, because cautery is at the pacemaker or the ICD site.
No, I'm talking
that doesn't spread.
RT-PCR positive patient. I'm talking of doing a procedure in
no. So in a RT-PCR negative patient, there is no issue with cautery.
No issue at all.
No, Karthikeya, but what actually I understood from your thing is, and that's what I am practicing is, I use liberally the cautery. We have been doing COVID positive patients with the pacemakers. That's not, I mean, we have done not less than about 10, the COVID positive patients with the pacemakers so far. See, we have used cautery quite liberally, or the way what you have been using. I do not think there was, like the infectious disease specialists here, they have never told us that aerosol is equivalent to what you had recommended about the ascitic fluids and the aerosols, right?
That's what I am also saying. You should use.
So I do not think we should be stopping the cautery. At the same time, there was one more thing. I think that is it's practiced more in the West. They are even are afraid of coming towards the thorax or at the regular pacemaker site implantation. They are doing the so-called leadless pacemakers more often. I think that is a lame excuse of putting in leadless, because they are not nearer to the respiratory tract of the patient. they are at the groin, which will probably protect them more. I think that is also a misconception.
Yes, I agree.
I had one just practical question. See, I have not done any COVID positive implants. So what used to happen, because all these patients, they go in the admission because the COVID status is not known. They go in the suspicious ICU and COVID is tested. And then if COVID is found, mostly we would avoid the temporary pacing if the rate is good. And then wait for a few days till the patient becomes negative and then do it. So what were the actual precautions you would take if you're implanting a COVID positive patient? And on which day would you decide to do it? Day 4, day 5, like what was the timeline which you would follow, and what extra, because you are on the head end of the patient operating almost near the face or the mouth. So what extra precaution you would take?
See, Amaya, if the patient is COVID positive and if he falls into the emergency, okay, we do not care when he had acquired the infection. Okay, it doesn't really mean much. Even if it is 3rd day, 4th day, 5th day, as long as his status is COVID positive, and if it's emergency, we will take him to the dedicated cath lab, and adequate PPE and other precautions we would take. So that has been the policy.
Dr. Nambudri, this bradycardia has been seen quite a lot during and after COVID, and there is a question in the chat box also about this. Usually it's been benign, but what is your ideas about why is this happening? It seems to be in the lower, late 40s or early 50s kind of range. A lot of people actually contacted me also for this, that they have had bradycardia. Nowadays everybody has an oximeter, so they know their heart rate. So what is your view about this bradycardia which is happening, which is it doesn't make sense in this, because it's fever, there is sympathetic response, and still they are having bradycardia.
I think Delhi, GB Panda also had published a paper on bradyarrhythmia associated with an IPJ 6 months back. But I feel it is probably quite coincident. I don't think there is any direct relationship, though there had been some sinus bradycardia described with, but arrhythmia that requires necessitating immediate pacing intervention and all, I don't think it is a direct consequence of COVID infection. But of course, in Kerala, the practice is totally different. Down south, it is totally different from Delhi and even from Bangalore. And our management is, number of patients has not come down significantly, only during this knockdown phase. Otherwise, we have been, practicing almost as before, except that we have not been doing complex 3D based ablations, because whenever we tried with some remote control of this 3D and all, it did not work very well because of some connectivity issues and time lag. But otherwise, this week also we have done 3 conduction system patients. The number of cases has not come down. Of course, regarding the pacing part, ablation we are doing, a staged way, in the sense the complex ablations we are not doing much now because of the COVID. Otherwise, simple ablations we post regularly and do. Yeah.
May I suggest that the IHRS comes out with one statement, simple statement, which we all of us popularize on the social media, and Vanita, if you can give it in the press release. I am facing, and I don't know how many of you are facing, but regularly this problem that my pulse rate has gone to 30, and this is because of pulse oximeter. This pulse oximeter, while being really thing, has created for us unnecessary panic in patients who are then rushing to doctors, rushing to hospitals, and exposing themselves. And every clinic, I have about 2 patients who come because of pulse oximeter created bradycardia. So I tell them pulse oximeter is for oxygen, and other one is blood pressure instrument. Blood pressure instrument is for blood pressure. And either you learn to check the pulse yourself, or if you have an Apple 4 watch or something, that's fine. Otherwise, so can we give a statement that please do not measure pulse with pulse oximeter and BP instrument? As IHR is creating, it's really created a lot of havoc at least in Bombay. I don't know about the rest of the country.
No, I may differ slightly, because our experience is that sinus bradycardia is actually very common. As common as sinus tachycardia, especially during the second phase of the illness. in the about second week of the illness. And in fact, many of our patients just get an Holter, and then we have find a lot of sinus bradycardia patients. But fortunately, I have seen that the outcome of these patients is actually very good. So I have a feeling that COVID somehow affects the autonomic nervous system in a couple of ways. One is it will reduce the sympathetic drive and increase the parasympathetic drive, and these patients have sinus bradycardia, and which may be a cause of concern for the patient. But fortunately, these patients do very well. The other group is, I think everybody have seen those patients who come after they have recovered from COVID and they have sinus tachycardia. During the first surge and initial months, we used to think that this is all anxiety. But now we have realized that patients, even when they are not at all anxious, they still do have sinus tachycardia. And I found propranolol to work very well in the management of these patients. Since they have already recovered, again, these patients do quite well, and 1 month or so of propranolol 40 milligram does wonders. I don't have data to support that, but that's what our clinical experience is. As far as pulse oximetry showing slow pulse rate, I think pulse oximeter, not everybody has a BP instrument. So pulse oximeter do have a role in detecting your pulse rate. But you have to make sure that the patient understand that you have to wait for some time before it records the actual pulse rate. Plus, if the patient has a history of PVCs, it may show abnormally low pulse rate because PVCs may not generate adequate pulse. Thirdly, patients who have sleep apnea, if they record their pulse rate during the night, which is actually now very common, with everybody having a pulse oximeter, they are bound to have slow pulse rate during the night. But I feel that still COVID second phase, especially in mild or early moderate disease, patients do have sinus bradycardia, but we have found a good clinical outcome of these patients.
So Karthik, my question was not only for COVID patients. This is for non-COVID, nothing. People are just recording, and because of PVCs, they are coming. That's one.
Yes.
Second, I have always from so many years found that we underestimate the use of teaching patients to check their pulse. Rather than doing extended Holters and ILRs, most patients can check their pulse during symptoms. And there can be my clinic staff, none of them are medical. They beautifully check the pulse. So if a non-medical person can be taught how to check the pulse, but my message is that, and you also said that in COVID, even if they get some bradycardia, there's a good prognosis. So why not check it with your hand? Why rely on the pulse oximeter for pulse, which is creating much more unnecessary anxiety and unnecessary doctor and emergency room visits?
Yeah, I agree completely. But the pulse measured by manually also will be low at during that time, because the reason, if it is PVCs, it will not it will result in a pulse.
Yeah. So actually, what I do in these scenarios, because when I got COVID and I had bradycardia also, so where I had a lot of time to give video consults, and usually I would ask them to show me the retracing of the waveform of the oximeter on video, because then it becomes very clear whether it is artifact or true bradycardia or there are PVCs. So that is one thing I found was useful. But I totally agree that we need to give some kind of a educative statement in public about this, because this PVC thing is really creating a lot of this pseudo bradycardia patients, because everybody has an oximeter and all of them are, they keep on checking it, just like their smartphones, people keep on checking. Nowadays, people keep on checking their oximeters. So,
Karthik,
Actually,
I have
the
a
panic
doubt
attack
whether.
which is created by this. Sorry, go ahead, Karthik. Go ahead.
No,
Yeah, I would
Karthik,
add
some of
that when you are giving this statement, also add that all the apps which smartphones have to measure the oxygen saturation or blood pressure are totally inaccurate and should not be relied. I actually had a fight with one of the patient. He said, "No, my blood pressure is always normal. I have been measuring it with my smartphone." So that's actually much more important.
Karthik, I suggest that Vivek, you and Vanita, get between three of you, make this draft and send it to the rest of the EC, because you can't, or you can send it to the general body and ask for anything, but then it will become too drawn out. And in good faith, you send it to the EC, and we quickly, if everybody ratifies, suggests some changes, we give out some public statement. I think it will be a good service.
Yeah,
it will avoid the panic which is unnecessarily created.
Yes.
And then you were saying something.
No, no, I was just wondering whether some of these patients with the persistent sinus tachycardia following late after COVID infection, some of them could be having an ongoing low-level systemic inflammation, because there are also case reports of sudden cardiac death following COVID, and systemic inflammation can lead on to SCD and also plaque rupture, and we need to see whether they, simply due to autonomic imbalance, or we need to have some correlation with the other inflammatory markers as well. Just a thought only.
Yeah, I agree. But actually, these patients, those who come for tachycardia per se, have normal CRP and normal. Those who have CRP high, they somehow they don't have tachycardia as their presentation. They will have something else like fever or something else. So it's this disease is actually.
Yeah, this is what we also see. We also checked the CRP and procalcitonin in most of them, and we found that it was apparently normal. So we also labeled it as anxiety for the sake of it.
Yeah. But CDC has given a guidance now about this MIS-A, just like MIS-C in children. But I think that is a much more sicker subset of people than the people who come for sinus tachycardia, as Karthik mentioned. I think it is autonomic imbalance, probably, because a lot of them also have postural symptoms.
Yeah. Correct.
So if there are no more
it's
questions.
time to wind up. Yeah. Dr. Vivek, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just said, if there are no more questions, we should wind up the session now. Feeling hungry.
It was a very it was a very good session. I have really enjoyed Deepak and Ullas.
Same here.
Great job. And of course, our fantastic 3 are here. I don't know. I couldn't find the.
Yeah, Vinita did not see.
Yeah. But it was a great session, and we learned a lot, and we will definitely work on that public statement that we have to issue. Vivek and Karthikeya, I'll be disturbing you for that. And
by the way, Vanita,
yes,
I got a lot of several feedback from non-IHRS members, and please convey it to Dr. Monica that her contribution was fabulous.
Thank you, sir. I will do that, sir. Sure, I'll do that. I have already done it after the session, of course, but I will do that again. I anyway have to talk to her. She is my physician also, sir.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
So much of information, we should put a consensus statement. Rather than we should put a consensus statement, because a lot of information has come up in the last 1.5 years. And that would definitely add to a, Dr. Ullas had shown so many interesting things which most of us were not aware. And all these aspects taking into it, probably you should come up with a statement from IHRS, like a paper.
Nambudiri, can you take the responsibility of you and your team along with Selvaraj? No, you and Selvaraj, seriously. And really, you're right. It's 1.5 years now. We need to come out with something in the IPEJ.
Let's do that again.
Sir, if you could nominate a group of persons with
you and Selvaraj and you, and then you take 2 more people, or 3 more people, or 4 more people whom you feel.
Yeah, we'll keep in touch, sir. Sure.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Good night. And we meet next week for the mini symposium on atrial fibrillation. So see you all there. Good night.